Hi, this is Dr. Brian Walsh, and welcome to the first of the Fat Is Not Your Fault videos, the Insulin-Fat Loss Connection. Today we'll be talking all about insulin, what it is, what it does, how it works, why it's secreted, how it impacts health and disease, and of course we'll talk about its relationship to your inability to lose weight. Then we'll talk about ways of evaluating your own blood sugar and insulin to see if it is an issue for you, and we'll talk about what to do about it. So what is insulin? Insulin is a hormone. It's considered to be a peptide hormone or a protein hormone, and we'll talk more about that in a little while. But it's a peptide hormone that's secreted in an organ in your abdominal region called your pancreas. Your pancreas is a rather long and sort of slender organ, and it's right near your small intestines. And this is for two reasons. One is your pancreas, the primary function of your pancreas is to actually release digestive enzymes or pancreatic enzymes. And these enzymes are secreted into your small intestine, and we'll talk all about this in the gastrointestinal fat loss connection video, into your small intestine in order to help digest your food so that you can absorb all the nutrients and extract everything from your food in order to fuel and feed your body. However, the second function of the pancreas is to help regulate your body's blood sugar. And we'll talk about why regulating your blood sugar is so critically important in just a second. The pancreas releases a couple of different hormones. One we'll spend more time on, and the other one we're not going to talk so much about. One of the hormones is called glucagon. Glucagon is released when your body's blood sugar gets too low, and it is one of the hormones that's made in the pancreas. The other hormone is insulin. Insulin is secreted from the pancreas when your blood sugar gets too high. Now, why is glucose so important to help regulate in your body? First of all, as we already talked about, glucose is your primary and preferred energy source for all of your vital organs, from your brain, your cardiovascular system, as well as your abdominal organs and your skeletal muscles. So you need a certain amount of glucose in order to help sustain the function of these. Now, your body can store glucose very, very well in a molecule called glycogen. The problem is that the brain does not store glucose. And so for reasons of brain health and brain function and your nervous system function, you need to have a stable level of blood sugar all the time because your brain doesn't store glucose as glycogen very well. So you need to have a steady, stable glucose level, and that's why you have many hormones, one of which being called glucagon, that if your blood sugar gets too low, that can actually increase your blood sugar, mostly for brain health. Now, what's the problem if glucose gets too high? After all, if it's helping to produce energy or ATP in your body, how come too much blood sugar or glucose is a problem? Well, glucose in high amounts is actually toxic to your body. It's toxic to things like your nervous system and your kidneys and your eyes and a variety of other things as well. And it's because of glucose's toxicity that diabetics have some of the major complications that they do. So the pancreas then releases a very powerful hormone called insulin when your blood sugar gets too high and would therefore be too toxic to those systems of your body to help regulate that, to help bring glucose into the cells as storage for later use or for energy if it's needed immediately. But we'll talk more about insulin and how that works in just a second. So again, just to summarize, when you eat a food, you swallow it down your esophagus, it goes into your stomach for a little bit, then it goes into your small intestines. Now, as the pancreas releases some of its digestive enzymes, it starts to break down this food that you've eaten, and it goes into your bloodstream. Now, the first place that it goes when it goes into your bloodstream is into your liver. So this will bring in all the nutrients, all the amino acids, all the fat, all the glucose, the vitamins, the minerals, everything that you eat first goes into the liver. And again, we'll talk more about this both in the gastrointestinal video and the toxicity video when we talk more about the liver. After the liver processes all this, then it goes into your circulating bloodstream. So if you just ate a meal, let's say you just ate a plate full of pasta, a lot of that pasta will be absorbed as glucose. It will be digested and broken down and absorbed into your system as blood sugar or glucose. It goes into your liver, and it circulates throughout your body. And as it circulates around, when it eventually, that glucose level reaches your pancreas senses this and then releases insulin into your body to help regulate that. So that's the basic structure of how insulin is released. Now what we're going to talk about is the functions of insulin and a little bit in how it works. So what are some of the functions of insulin? Now that you know a little bit of how insulin works, again, you eat food, it gets absorbed into your bloodstream. Depending on the level of blood sugar, your pancreas will sense that amount of blood sugar, and then the what's called the beta cells within the pancreas will release the hormone insulin, which will help bring glucose, which is toxic to your blood and your body, out of your bloodstream and into the appropriate cells. So what are some of the functions of glucose, or of insulin? One of the things that insulin will act upon, of course, is the liver. And one of the things that it does in the liver is a phenomenal organ. It does over 200 things. One of the things that it does really well is it stores things. One of the things that it stores very well is glucose. So one of the things that insulin will do in the liver is it will increase what's called glycogen. And when it increases glycogen, this is a storage form of blood sugar for later use. Now, because the liver is so good at storing glucose in the form of glycogen, it can also liberate this glycogen if your blood sugar ever gets too low. But in the case of insulin, if insulin is released because your blood sugar is too high, then it will not only store glucose as glycogen, but it will stop a process called gluconeogenesis, or we'll just say glucose release. And that makes sense, because if your blood sugar is too high, you don't want more blood sugar. So one of the things that insulin does on the liver is it increases the storage of glucose as glycogen, and it inhibits the release of new glucose called gluconeogenesis. Another thing that insulin does is it acts on your skeletal muscles. And in skeletal muscle, it does the same thing. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how cells work and how they actually make energy in the last video on cellular health, fat loss connection. But right now, what we'll just suffice it to say that muscle stores glucose. It uses the glucose as an energy. So for example, if you're actively using your skeletal muscles or you're exercising, for example, you will be using much of that glucose to provide energy, or ATP. But if you're not using them, then skeletal muscle is a great place of storage as well. So insulin in muscle will also increase glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose for later use. Another thing that insulin will do is it will act on adipose tissue, or fat. Now this is where some of the problems come in. When it comes to fat, your body can convert glucose into triglycerides, which most people have heard of. So insulin, when it comes to fat, increases storage of triglycerides, again, for future energy use, and it decreases breakdown of fat. Because again, right now, if your blood sugar is high, you don't need more. You actually need to get rid of it, again, because it's toxic to your body. So insulin, one of its jobs from the pancreas is to impact the fat cells. And what it does then is it increases the storage of triglycerides, or it decreases the breakdown at the same time. So now you're getting less breakdown and more storage anytime that insulin is released. And again, the higher the insulin level, the more glucose is going to go into the cells. The more the glycogen stores are filled up, then the more of it is going to spill over in triglycerides. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then the last thing that insulin does is insulin is associated with another hormone called leptin. And actually what I could have done is drawn leptin from the fat molecule, because leptin is a hormone that's produced by fat. It's produced by your adipose tissue. Leptin is a hormone that acts on your brain and tells you to stop eating, tells you that you're full, that you're satisfied, and that you don't need food any longer. And that also makes sense, because when you eat a meal and your blood sugar goes up, insulin is released to help store that. And the message to your body is, I have enough food right now. I need to take care of the blood sugar that we do have and store that, and we don't need to be eating anymore right now because we have plenty. So one of the things that insulin does is it's associated with leptin secretion. And leptin, again, is secreted by your fat cells. It acts on part of your brain called the hypothalamus, which then tells you that you're done eating and you no longer should be hungry anymore. Now, we'll talk about how some of these impacts can become negative or become dysfunctional in a little bit later. So right now, though, let's talk a little bit about how insulin actually works in getting glucose into the cells. Now, I mentioned before that glucose, or insulin rather, insulin is considered to be a peptide hormone. And a peptide hormone is a protein hormone. Protein hormones cannot get directly into cells. If you remember back to possibly high school biology, if we were to draw a very large cell here, if we were to draw a very large cell, the outer membrane of all the cells of our body is made out of fat. It's a phosphobilipid layer. So anything that's fat can get directly into your cell. So things like vitamin D. Vitamin D knows the secret handshake and can get a free ride into the cell to act on the nucleus of the cell. Other hormones like testosterone or estrogen or cortisol, those are based off of fat, and we'll talk about those in other videos as well. But those have the ability to get right into the cell also. Now, insulin, remember, is a protein. It's a very large protein hormone, and it can't get in. So it needs a special receptor in order to get into the cell. So let's say you have glucose outside of the cell. These red circles here will be glucose. So you just ate a meal, and you need to get glucose into the cells for energy production or for storage. Energy production if you need it right then and there. Storage if you might need it for a later date. Glucose can't get into the cell by itself either. So it needs insulin in order to help do this. Now what we'll do is we'll draw a receptor. This is a receptor for insulin. It too is made out of protein. The nucleus will manufacture the receptors for its own cell membranes. Now, this receptor on the underside of it, if you will, and it doesn't actually act like this, but I just want to give you an idea of how insulin actually works so that we can talk about how some problems can arise if any of these things become dysfunctional. So, on the outside of the cell you have glucose. You have a receptor for insulin, actually multiple receptors for insulin. And then on the inside, you have what you could consider to be a dormant messenger. It's a second messenger that when it becomes activated, will do a number of different things in the body. Now, we have a couple more things to quickly draw here. Inside the cell, you have these vesicles, and there's many. And again, this is an overly simplified version, but hopefully this will give you some understanding of what actually happens. You have what are called GLUT4 vesicles. And we'll draw a couple of those here. So you have these GLUT or GLUT4 vesicles, and what they have is little straws. Imagine little straws or miniature toilet paper rolls, if you will, that are attached to this vesicle inside the cell. These little straws allow glucose to come into the cell. But if you notice, right now, these little straws or these channels are on the inside of the cell associated with these GLUT4 vesicles. Now, here's basically what happens. So here you have the insulin receptor. You eat a meal. Glucose goes up into your bloodstream. It's toxic to your body, and your body knows this. So it wants to get it into the cells as much as it can. It could be a fat cell, it could be the liver in the form of glycogen, or it can be into skeletal muscle. You have glucose in the body, and your body needs to get rid of it. The best place to get rid of it quickly is into the cell. It needs insulin in order to do this. So insulin is released from the pancreas. And when insulin binds to this cell receptor, this dormant molecule on the inside, this second messenger, wakes up. And he's very happy because now he has something to do. Insulin does not get into the cell. Insulin merely binds onto this receptor, which then stimulates a second messenger. And the second messenger then, through a series of events, which we won't go into detail, stimulates these GLUT4 vesicles to move towards the surface and insert their straws, the glucose channels, into the cell. So what happens is blood sugar goes up, insulin is released from the pancreas. The pancreas releases insulin, which then binds onto a receptor. Remember, it's a protein hormone and it can't get in. Binds onto the receptor, stimulates something within the cell that now tells these GLUT4 vesicles to go to the surface, which they do. They bind with the surface membrane, and they allow their channels to go into the membrane wall, which now these channels are glucose channels, and these essentially allow glucose from the bloodstream, from the body, into the cell. Again, to be utilized as immediate energy in ATP, which we'll talk about in later videos, or to be stored as something like glycogen or triglycerides. So, again, you eat a meal, your blood sugar goes up. Depending on how much it goes up, the pancreas senses this and releases insulin in order to deal with this. Insulin is a protein hormone, and you have a bilipid fat layer around a cell, so protein hormones can't get in, and it's too large. So insulin then binds onto an insulin receptor. This receptor stimulates proteins on the inside and enzymes on the inside of the cell that stimulate these GLUT or GLUT4 vesicles that have glucose channels associated with them to the membrane to allow glucose to come in. This is in healthy physiology, how it's supposed to work. Now, I did draw two GLUT4 vesicles here for a reason. One type of GLUT4 vesicle is insulin dependent, meaning this will only travel to the membrane in the presence of insulin. Other GLUT4 vesicles, however, and this makes a strong argument for exercise, other GLUT4 vesicles are exercise induced. In other words, if you exercise, it's a stress and you need glucose. So certain hormones like cortisol, epinephrine, glucagon, they will be released while you're exercising to help liberate some of the stored glycogen in your skeletal muscle and your liver in order to be used for immediate energy right then and there while you're exercising. You need to get glucose into the cell, however. So in order to get glucose into the cell, you have exercise-induced GLUT4 vesicles that don't need insulin, that they go to the surface, their glucose channels go into the membrane and allow glucose to come in. This is one reason why, and I've personally seen, people that have exercised for a large portion of their life, get into maybe their 80s or 90s, stop exercising, usually due to some kind of injury or health issue, and then shortly after are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. That their insulin may have not been functioning well, but they still were exercising and they were still able to utilize these non-insulin dependent GLUT4 vesicles that were exercise dependent to allow glucose in. It's a phenomenal system. Okay, so now that you have a brief understanding of what happens with insulin, here's the question: what can go wrong? Well, now that you understand the system a little bit, here's one of the first things that can go wrong. Let's say, for example, somebody cannot produce enough insulin. If somebody is not producing insulin, the glucose can't get into the cell. If they don't have insulin, the receptors aren't stimulated. If the receptors aren't stimulated, the intracellular messengers aren't stimulated, and the GLUT4 vesicles can't come to the surface to allow all this excess glucose in. Now, one of the reasons why you have low insulin, or the primary reason, is because there's some dysfunction in the pancreas. There's type 1 diabetes, which is usually found in people prior to age 30. But in late-stage diabetics, they actually have a difficult time producing insulin themselves, and therefore they have low insulin levels, and this glucose builds up in the system, becomes toxic, and can cause a lot of damage. So that's the first issue, is your pancreas making adequate amounts of insulin in order to get glucose into the cell? The second thing, and this is very common, we'll talk a little bit more about this, is if there's issues with the receptors. Now, receptors on a cell membrane will start to downregulate if there's ever too much of a hormone. And in today's day and age, with excess food consumption, not enough exercise, poor lifestyle habits, not getting enough sleep, for example, maybe being overly stressed, if you get too much blood sugar, you get too much insulin. Too much insulin then starts to downregulate or damage these receptors. And there's other things that can damage these as well. But if you can have all the insulin that you want, but if the receptors aren't working, the second messengers on the inside of the cell won't work, the GLUT4 vesicles and the glucose channels can't come to the cell membrane and glucose can't get in. So there's two possible defects. One is with insulin secretion in the pancreas. Two, and probably more common today, is insulin damage. Now, this is often referred to as insulin resistance, that you have insulin, but you're resistant to it. Your body's not working appropriately. The receptors aren't working appropriately. So that's considered to be insulin resistant, which is a lot of people have heard about. And we'll talk a little bit more about insulin resistance as well. Now, we're not going to go into these other defects, but obviously then the third possible area of defect is something within the cell. Maybe the GLUT4 vesicles aren't working, maybe some of these messengers, proteins, and enzymes aren't working properly, and that's a little bit more detailed, and we're not going to get into that. But you can see that for glucose to get into the cell, you have to have all of this working properly, and we'll talk about some ways that you can do that and strategies if you do have an insulin issue. So now that you know about insulin, how it works, how it helps glucose get into the cell, and why it does what it does, let's talk about some of the issues that can arise when you have insulin that's too high. First, we'll talk about some of the issues of insulin regarding health and disease, and then we'll talk about how it can impact fat loss. So in red, what we'll do is we'll draw some of the issues of elevated insulin. Now, elevated insulin is known to do a few things that can facilitate a disease process or a pathological process. One of the things is high insulin is known to help raise blood pressure. Okay, and that becomes a cardiovascular risk. Another way that it affects the cardiovascular system is it can increase cholesterol. In fact, elevated insulin is probably the number one reason why somebody might have high cholesterol. It's a basic biochemical pathway that insulin upregulates the enzyme that's responsible for your internal cholesterol production. So high cholesterol, most frequently today, is caused by high insulin, which therefore makes it a fairly easy thing to fix. Elevated insulin can also cause, therefore, an increase in the cardiovascular risk of somebody due to the high cholesterol, due to high blood pressure, due to some inflammation that occurs as well. Another thing that insulin can do is it can cause, and this can go not only in pathological, but also when it comes to fat loss issues as well, is it can increase your chances of mood disorders. And mood disorders, of course, are very prevalent today. Now, we're going to talk more about this in the neurotransmitter fat loss connection. But elevated insulin can most certainly cause neurotransmitter imbalances and therefore mood imbalances. And mood imbalances aren't so much a disease process per se, but when it comes to being motivated to follow a diet program or an exercise program, if your mood is not optimal, if you're not feeling high amounts of willpower, if you're not feeling happy and joyful, then following those programs can actually be difficult. So high insulin levels, high blood sugar levels can absolutely impact mood, which can unwind a fat loss program by itself simply because somebody doesn't have the motivation to do it. And lastly, elevated insulin when it comes to pathology or disease has actually been correlated with an increased cancer risk. And that's one of the reasons why, is because insulin is considered to be an anabolic hormone, meaning it grows things, it makes things bigger and proliferate. If you have cancer, elevated insulin can actually increase your risk of cancer. So now let's talk a little bit about how elevated insulin can impact fat loss. Well, in men, elevated insulin is known to upregulate the enzyme that's associated with estrogen, and they'll convert more of their testosterone over to estrogen. This is very common today, and high estrogen in men will definitely cause fat loss difficulties. Now, in women, it's kind of the opposite. In women, it will tend to increase testosterone, which again is very common today and is probably one of the #1 causes of infertility, which is at an all-time high today. So if you have high insulin, then there's a good chance if you're a woman that you might have elevated androgens or male hormones, one of them being testosterone. And if you're male, you might have high estrogen. Now, another problem that insulin causes is it causes a decrease in liver function. And when you have a decrease in liver function, there's a number of reasons, and we'll talk more about this in the toxicity section, but there's a number of different possibilities or causes or things that can occur if your liver's not working well. And 2 of those things actually happen to be your ability to metabolize and clear out hormones. So if you're a man and you do have high estrogen, or if you're a woman and you do have high testosterone, you'll have a harder time clearing those out and getting rid of those if your liver's not functioning well. And one of the things that insulin does is it negatively impacts your liver's ability to metabolize and detoxify things. Another thing that insulin does, and the research is a little bit mixed on this one. However, insulin has been shown in some studies to increase something called interleukin-6. Interleukin-6 is a pro-inflammatory molecule. And this pro-inflammatory molecule has a number of very negative impacts on the body. In fact, some people suggest that interleukin-6 is one of the best cardiovascular risk markers beyond cholesterol or CRP or homocysteine or any of those things, that IL-6 is one of the best markers for cardiovascular disease because it's such a well-known pro-inflammatory cytokine or pro-inflammatory molecule. But here's the problem when it comes to interleukin-6. Interleukin-6 is also known to stimulate a stress response, or cortisol. And we'll talk more about cortisol in the next video, on the cortisol fat loss connection video. But interleukin-6 increases cortisol. Now, without going into the details of it right now, cortisol's primary role in the body is to raise your blood sugar. Well, that's a problem because you had high blood sugar in the first place, which is why insulin became high. So you had high blood sugar, insulin was released. If you have chronically elevated insulin, that can stimulate excess production of interleukin-6. Interleukin-6 stimulates more cortisol. Of course, cortisol's primary role in the body is to increase blood sugar or glucose. And the problem with that is when you have increased blood sugar or glucose levels, that will then stimulate insulin. And what you have now is a vicious cycle that can occur. And then the last thing that we can talk about is insulin, again, is associated with leptin, or the satiety hormone, telling you that you're full and you no longer need to keep eating. What you can get now is you can get increased leptin levels which, because leptin is a hormone, leptin in excess levels can also downregulate the leptin receptors found in the brain, and that can contribute to something called leptin resistance. Now, if you have leptin resistance, just as the word would apply, or the phrase would imply, is that if you have leptin resistance, you can have plenty of leptin circulating in your body, but it's not getting to where it needs to go. It's not getting into the cell. And if it doesn't get into the cell, you don't get the signal to stop eating. And one of the classic symptoms of somebody with insulin resistance is that they constantly want to eat. That they eat food and they don't have that satiety signal to tell them to stop eating. So they continue eating, they continue having sugar cravings, and they continue to want to eat many times throughout the day and more food than they should be eating because leptin is not getting where it needs to go, and due to the fact that it's resistant because of the elevated insulin levels. So this is a brief overview of how elevated insulin not only contributes to certain disease or pathology states, as well as how it can negatively impact fat loss on just a few levels. Okay, now that we've talked about insulin, where it's made, why it's made, what it does, how it does it, and the problems that can be caused with elevated insulin levels, let's talk a little bit about the progression. Okay, everybody knows about diabetes. Diabetes, again, is reaching almost pandemic levels. It's been estimated that diabetes alone could bankrupt the United States healthcare industry within the next couple of decades just by itself. But let's talk about how this really works and how you might be able to catch some of these issues well before they actually become issues in the first place. So here we have what would be considered to be normal, healthy glucose levels. There are some people that would suggest that lower glucose is even better, but you need to have a certain amount of blood sugar at all times in your body, mostly for your brain. Now, most of your other organs can survive without glucose, or they have storage forms of glucose called glycogen that if your blood sugar gets too low, that you can liberate some of these things within those particular tissues and cells themselves. The brain doesn't store glucose very well. So you need to keep and maintain a healthy window of blood sugar at all times for reasons of preventing toxicity if your glucose gets too high, or ultimately for your brain not to work well and have some kind of dysfunction if it gets too low. Okay, so this is the window of glucose that you'd like to have. Now let's say we have our modern society today. We have people that are relatively sedentary, or maybe eating a poor diet, or let's say you're eating a perfect diet and you're exercising, but you have a lot of stress, which again we'll talk about more in another video. If you have a lot of stress, you'll release stress hormones, and their job is to increase blood sugar for reasons of energy production during the stress. So let's say somebody who has normal blood sugar eats a meal, and or even if they have a stress response, their blood sugar goes too high. Okay, so it goes up above 100. Your body senses this, and again, your pancreas will sense the high blood sugar, and it will release insulin in order to deal with it. We'll make glucose red, and we'll make insulin blue. So when it goes up, what happens is insulin will also go up in order to help deal with this. Now, if the blood sugar gets too high and everything is working really well, what will happen is glucose will actually drop down too low. Okay, so with elevated insulin levels, what it'll do is it will drive glucose down below what it should be if everything is working well. The more blood sugar you have, the more insulin you make, and the better your receptors are working, it will drive glucose down too low. Now, I will tell you, and this is not unfortunately something that you'll hear very often, this is potentially one of the first signs, early signs, of insulin resistance and diabetes. The reason why glucose gets so low is because insulin gets so high. Normally what you would want is blood sugar to go up just a little bit, and then insulin will go up a little bit to deal with it as well. The higher the glucose goes, the more insulin is released. The more insulin is released, the more it drives glucose into the cell, because everything right now is working very, very well. So hopefully that makes sense. One of the first and earliest signs of very early insulin resistance and diabetes may actually be low blood sugar. Okay, then what happens? So if we were to kind of keep track on this, this would be high glucose, or I should say high insulin, high insulin and low glucose. That'd be the very, very first potential sign that somebody had blood sugar mismanagement issues. Now, let's say this has been going on for a while, and over time the insulin level was so incredibly high that the receptors on the cells stopped working as well. Not completely, but let's say you had 100 receptors on a cell for insulin, and they're only working about 25% as well now. So maybe they have 75 receptors for insulin on a given cell. So now what happens is insulin may stay just as high, but because you have less receptors that are working well, you can't get all that glucose into the cells. So now you might actually have normal blood sugar. And again, this would be really hard to pick up on somebody, because if you see normal blood sugar on somebody, of course there's no problem. But in fact, maybe there is. So in this particular case, what you might see is high insulin, and you might see normal glucose. So that would be the next step. This is characterized by a normal glucose, but still high insulin, because your pancreas and your beta cells are still making insulin, but because some of the receptors are no longer working, now glucose might not be no longer low, but is now considered to be normal. So then that's the second step, or in the progression towards diabetes or insulin resistance. Now I'll tell you that because the insulin is so high in these individuals, they will have all those problems that we just talked about. If it's a man, he might have normal glucose, but he might have high estrogen as a consequence of the insulin. If it's a woman, she might have high testosterone. High insulin levels would probably impact certain detoxification pathways in the liver, for example. It will probably start impacting things like leptin that we talked about as well, or cortisol as well, through interleukin 6. Now, so what's the next stage in the progression? By this point, and you may be looking at potentially years of this going on by now, maybe 3 or 4 years. By this point, now what might happen is the pancreas might stop producing insulin as well. If it's been overproducing insulin for this long, the beta cells of the pancreas might not be working as well. So you may actually have a decrease in insulin levels. So now you might have insulin levels that would almost be considered normal. But there's 2 problems here. You have less insulin, but prior to this, you started having insulin receptor issues. So now you have issues with the ability of the receptor to utilize insulin, and you have less insulin than you did in the first place. So now what you might have is high glucose. Okay? And this is where people are usually caught in the medical industry today. Is they'll have somewhat high insulin levels, but when you measure, or glucose levels, but when you measure their insulin level is not that high. It's not as high as one would expect. That's because the pancreas is probably starting to wear out a little bit by now. It's not making as much insulin. The receptors have been damaged on the cells because insulin has been high for so long. So now you're looking at high glucose and maybe normal insulin. So this third phase may be characterized by normal insulin and elevated glucose. And so then what's the final stage? The final stage would be characterized by the pancreas still making less. Now by this point it's probably not able to make very much at all. And so what you might see now is actually potentially low insulin levels, and you might have excessively high glucose. And that's because you have damage to the receptor sites. The pancreas is no longer able to make insulin adequately, so you have excess glucose in the blood, and this is when it starts to become toxic. So here you might actually have low insulin, and you might have excessively high glucose, or diabetes by this point. So, why do I say this? Because this progression starts very early. And if you know what you're looking for, and we'll talk about that in just a second, when you know what you're looking for, you can actually start to see these things early and catch it early. And if this is the situation here, you might have normal glucose but high insulin, you will have a hard time losing weight in this phase. If you have low blood sugar and high insulin, you will likely have a hard time losing weight in this phase as well. By the time it gets down here, you'll definitely have a hard time losing weight, but now it's a bigger issue. Now it's more of a disease process that's taking place. So this is a brief overview of the progression that blood sugar can take, going from normal healthy physiology down to full-blown diabetes. Okay, now that we've talked about insulin, where it's made, what it does, why it's released, how it works on the cells, some of the functions that it has all over the body, as well as some of the problems that can arise and the progression towards diabetes or serious blood sugar management issues, let's talk about how you might evaluate this in yourself. Now, first of all, With Fat Is Not Your Fault became a questionnaire. That questionnaire had blood sugar areas or blood sugar questions. The symptoms alone can be a great place to start. You can't rely on symptoms, okay? Because symptoms, for example, if somebody has fatigue, what could possibly cause fatigue? Well, there's too many things to really be able to pinpoint what might be causing fatigue. If you talk to one practitioner, it's because they're thyroid. If you talk to another practitioner, it's because they're anemic. And a third one might say it's their adrenal glands. So symptoms, however, can point you in the right direction. So for example, when you eat a meal, if you feel energized after that meal, chances are your blood sugar has tendencies of going too low, or what might be considered to be hypoglycemia, or hypoglycemic tendencies. If your blood sugar gets too low and you eat a meal, you'll feel energized afterwards. Conversely, if you eat a meal and you feel tired afterwards, then that's a pretty good indication that you might have early insulin resistance. The reason why is the process of getting glucose into glycogen is a pretty simple process, energetically speaking, for the body. However, getting glucose into triglycerides is a little bit more energy inefficient, meaning it takes more energy to do so. So if your glycogen reserves are stored or they're full and you have high glucose and your body needs to get rid of that otherwise toxic glucose, the second place is to put it into adipose tissue in the form of triglycerides. Again, that's more energy inefficient, so it requires more energy and therefore it can cause fatigue after meals. Another classic symptom for someone who's hypoglycemic is a cravings for sugar. The problem is people with insulin resistance can also have cravings for sugar. So how do you differentiate between the two? Individuals with hypoglycemic tendencies, when they eat sugar, they generally feel better. They no longer have their cravings, they now have energy, and they just feel like they can go on throughout their day. Somebody that has insulin resistance will tend to crave sweets, but when they eat the sweets, the cravings don't necessarily go away. And that's a really good example of glucose is not getting into the cells where it is needed for energy production. The body senses this and then sends signals of, please send me more sugar. I need more sugar because the cells ultimately are not getting enough. So the sugar cravings continue even after sugar or sweets is consumed. So those are a couple different symptoms that you might want to look for to try to decide. Now, symptoms, again, are good, but they certainly don't tell the whole picture. So then the next thing you want to do is to get a good blood chemistry. A good blood chemistry can tell you a lot about your blood sugar issues. Again, not perfect, and we've definitely seen people that had some pretty significant blood sugar management issues, but a fairly normal blood chemistry. But there's other ways that we can evaluate that, which we'll talk about in just a second. So on a blood chemistry, first of all, of course, you want to look at glucose. Glucose ideally should be anywhere between 80 and 100. That's, of course, using measurements or the system that we use here in the U.S. In different countries, you have different ranges, but I have that information in the supplement materials that are found with Fat Is Not Your Fault when you purchase these videos. Glucose should be between 80 and 100. If you do a fasting glucose and it's below 80, you might want to consider reactive hypoglycemic tendencies. Now again, you really need to talk with a qualified medical professional in order to be able to further evaluate this. But if your glucose is below 80, and if you skip meals between the day, you get shaky or irritable or lightheaded or agitated. Or another common one is people that have reactive hypoglycemia tend to wake up during the middle of the night, around 2 or 3 o'clock, more often than not. Then you might have reactive hypoglycemic tendencies. And there's a number of different reasons that could happen, which we'll talk about in future videos. If your glucose is above 100, however, then you might be looking at insulin resistance tendencies, and that's a fasting glucose, of course. But as we talked about when it comes to the progression, glucose is very limited in terms of its ability to indicate if you have a blood sugar issue, because early insulin resistance will be low blood sugar, slightly more progressed might be normal blood sugar, and only then might you start to see blood sugar start to creep up a little bit. So there are other things that you might want to look at in terms of on the blood chemistry. One of them is cholesterol. People with insulin resistance, as I mentioned before, will tend to upregulate the enzyme that increases your body's own production of cholesterol. So if your cholesterol is high, let's say above 200, then you might start to be looking at insulin resistance. Now, that's not the only reason why somebody can have high cholesterol. And we've seen people that have low cholesterol that definitely have full-blown diabetes. So this is not, again, a perfect marker. But if your cholesterol is above 200, you might be looking at insulin resistance. If your HDL is low, and we'll just go ahead and say maybe somewhere below 50. If it's below 50, all these things together, high glucose, high cholesterol, low HDL, which is supposedly the good cholesterol, then you might be looking at insulin resistance. But here's one of the best markers that you can look at when it comes to looking at the lipids, and that's triglycerides. Triglycerides, you're not so much concerned with the total amount of triglycerides, but rather the triglyceride cholesterol ratio. Now, what you want to see is about a 2-to-1 ratio. So if somebody has a cholesterol of 200, ideally they'll have a triglyceride level of about 100. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. Now, if somebody has cholesterol of 200 and their triglycerides are, let's say, 175, that's closer to a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's an even greater problem, obviously. That's because most of the glucose now is getting converted into triglycerides into adipose tissue, and therefore that is becoming elevated. So ideally, what you'd like to see is a 2-to-1 ratio of cholesterol to triglycerides. If somebody has a total cholesterol of 300, you'd want to see a triglycerides of about 150. If you see a total cholesterol of 150, which would be considered normal in most people's book, but the triglycerides were also 150, I would make a strong argument that that person likely had some kind of insulin-resistant tendencies. So you have glucose, cholesterol, HDL, and triglycerides on a blood chemistry. Those are some of the better markers, but then there's also one that you might want to consider running, and that's called hemoglobin A1C. Now, just to tell you a little bit about this marker, glucose is very unstable in the sense that, let's say you went down to get your blood drawn or you went to the doctor's office, and right before you went down, you got in a fight with your spouse. And then on the way there, you might have almost gotten into an accident, or you saw a police officer driving behind you, and that really stressed you out. Or when you get to the lab, you hate needles and you're deathly afraid of needles. Any one of those things can cause a stress response. And if you have that stress response, stress is designed to help raise blood sugar. So depending on when you were stressed when you went to the doctor to get your blood drawn, you might have elevated, the glucose might be too high or too low or normal, and it's totally inaccurate. So there's a better marker called hemoglobin A1C. Now, none of these markers are without any flaws, but hemoglobin A1C is a 3-month marker of blood sugar management in your body. That's because hemoglobin is a molecule that's associated with your red blood cells. Hemoglobin binds on to oxygen to carry it around your body into your tissues so that you can utilize oxygen. Red blood cells have a lifespan of about 120 days or 3 months. So anything that's measuring the hemoglobin level will give you about a 3-month window of whatever that is measuring. Hemoglobin A1C, therefore, or glycosylated hemoglobin, is considered to be a 3-month marker of blood sugar management. Now, most labs will say that anywhere above a hemoglobin A1C of above 5.7, you're at an increased risk of diabetes. And I do believe that that's to be true. We like to see a hemoglobin A1C of around 5.3, maybe 5.4. If that's the case, again, there are reasons why this could be falsely low. But if it's at a 5.3 and the glucose is good and the cholesterol triglyceride ratio is good and there's a lack of symptoms like getting fatigued after meals, then this person likely has really good blood sugar management in their body. Now, there's yet even another marker that you can run, and this one's a little bit more advanced, but it's certainly worth giving a shot if you think you might have blood sugar issues. Now, insulin, again, is a hormone made in your pancreas, and you can measure serum or blood levels of insulin. Now, the problem with that is insulin has a very short half-life, meaning once it's released, it's broken down very quickly in your body, and it's therefore not the best marker if you want to really look at insulin. A better marker is called C-peptide. C-peptide is made from your pancreas in the same quantity and rate as insulin. In other words, when your body releases insulin, it's also releasing C-peptide. So if your body releases, let's say, 100 units of insulin, it's going to release 100 units of C-peptide simultaneously. Now, the benefit of C-peptide is it has a longer half-life, meaning it sticks around in your body longer than does insulin. Insulin is not a very good marker on a blood chemistry, despite the fact that a lot of doctors are running this. C-peptide is a far better marker. So if you're truly interested in how much your body is producing insulin, C-peptide is a fantastic marker in order to look at that. Now, there's one last evaluation tool that I would strongly recommend for people, and it's called the glucose tolerance test. Now, your doctor can run a glucose tolerance test, but I strongly recommend that you do this on your own, in your own home. And the reason is because of this. To do the glucose tolerance test, all you need is a $20 glucometer that you can get at your local pharmacy or drugstore, or even at a store like Walmart or Target sells them as well. There are fancy ones that cost quite a bit, but all you need is a very inexpensive glucometer. It's the kind of thing that diabetics will typically use, and they can prick their finger, take a small sample of blood, and it will tell you your blood sugar level. Now, here's how you do the home glucose tolerance test and how you can interpret this. So what you do is, ideally you'll do this on a day when you have nothing going on for a couple of hours. So let's say, for example, you decide to do this on a Saturday. You wake up in the morning, and instructions for this, by the way, are found in the supplement materials that came along with this video. You wake up first thing in the morning, before you do anything else, before you don't eat food, you don't do anything, you basically wake up, you can brush your teeth if you want, but you wake up and you take your fasting morning glucose before you do just about anything else. So the first marker you have is upon awakening. Then what you want to do is, and you may want to check with your doctor before you do this, if you have any kind of known blood sugar issues, then you may, again, please check with your doctor before you do this. But what you now do is they sell glucose challenge drinks that you can also get in most pharmacies or drugstores. If you don't have access to those for some reason, you can use something as simple as grape juice. What you want to do is you want to try to get about 75 grams of a simple sugar or a high glycemic sugar like glucose, or like I said, grape juice can work well too. What we're looking for is tendencies and patterns. We're not looking for something very specific. So like I said, I think it ends up being about 12 ounces of grape juice, maybe 16, will give you about 75 grams of glucose or sugar. So you want to get about 75 grams. So you take your first fasting morning blood sugar, then you drink the solution, whether it's grape juice or what you find in a drugstore. Then you do nothing. And this is key. You need to sit around and watch TV, read a book, lay on the couch, journal, whatever it might be. But you don't want to go and mow the lawn, you don't want to do any work, you don't want to wash the dishes, you really just want to sit and do nothing. The reason why is because the second you do anything, you can negatively affect these results. You might start utilizing that blood sugar that you just consumed. And what you want to see is your body's response to blood sugar. So, when you're doing nothing, what you do then is you take another blood sugar measurement 20 minutes after you drink the solution. So let's say you wake up at 6 a.m. and let's say at 6:30 you drank your solution. 20 minutes later, which would be 6:50 a.m., you take your second blood sugar measurement. Then you do it again 20 minutes later. Then you do it again another 20 minutes later. Excuse me. Then you do it 30 minutes after that, followed by an additional 30 minutes after that. So then what you have is your first fasting morning glucose, you drink the solution, 20 minutes later you take your next blood sugar measurement, 20 minutes after that you take your next blood sugar measurement, 20 minutes after that you take your next blood sugar measurement, and then 30 minutes later and another 30 minutes later. This, from the time that you drink the solution to these 5 other markers, is 2 hours. So you're basically done by 8:30 in the morning. But that 2 hours was spent, you will learn a lot about your blood sugar and your body's ability to handle blood sugar, which we'll look about in just a second here. So that's the glucose tolerance test. It's very easy to do and very effective. Now, the reason why I recommend this versus one that you can get at your doctor's office is you're taking out the stress of going to the doctor's office and having to sit there for a long time and get your blood drawn multiple times. Two is when you have a glucometer of your own, you can use that in order to help figure out what is the best quantity and quality of food for you. In other words, let's say, for example, you have your glucometer and you want to see if your morning latte and bagel with cream cheese or muffin is doing anything negative to your blood sugar. You eat that meal, and about 30 minutes after you finish that meal, you take your blood sugar. If your blood sugar is too high, then that meal is not good for you. Then the next day what you can do is you can maybe try for breakfast, instead of having a latte and a muffin, is maybe having a small piece of salmon and some vegetables. 30 minutes later, take your blood sugar and find out what the difference is in your body when you take that salmon and salad or vegetable meal versus what you typically eat. And I'll tell you, another thing that we found is that sometimes people will drink a smoothie and they'll drink some protein powder or some great supplement that somebody sold them, and they're making a smoothie out of it. We've had them take their blood sugar after they've had a smoothie, which of course is considered to be healthy in these super smoothies and shakes that people make, and their blood sugar was far too high. And we've also found that certain powders raise blood sugar in some people more than others. So having a home glucometer test is fantastic for those particular things. Anyhow, so let's look at what you might see. Okay, so let's say here was when you drank the solution, you have 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 60 minutes, 90, and 120 minutes after the solution. These are all the times that you take your blood sugar. And then let's say you have normal blood sugar might be anywhere between 80 and 100. Let's say you're fasting glucose. We'll just do blue for normal. Let's say you woke up in the morning and your blood sugar when you took it and it was fasting was around 90. Okay? And then you drank the solution, and 20 minutes later it may have gone up to about 120. And then 40 minutes later, let's say it only went up to about 130. And then at 60 minutes later, it was back down to 120. 90 minutes later, it was 100. And 120 minutes or 2 hours later, it was back down to where you started at 90. This would be considered a pretty good blood sugar management curve. That you end where you start 2 hours later, and then it doesn't excessively go too high, or it doesn't end up going too low. So in blue, what I drew was what might be considered to be a normal blood sugar curve. So let's look at some other possibilities. Remember when I said that low blood sugar can be an early indication of insulin resistance? Well, if you have hypoglycemic tendencies, this is how your curve might look. So let's say this individual, let's say they also started at around 90. But let's say after 20 minutes, their blood sugar shot up to maybe 160. And then after 40 minutes, it was maybe 180. And then around 60 minutes was back down to around 90. And then at 90 minutes, dropped down to maybe 60. And then at 120 minutes was maybe around 80 or maybe even 70. This would be a classic example of somebody that first of all has hypoglycemic tendencies. Their blood sugar gets too low, and when it gets too low, that becomes an emergency state. And it's usually at these periods when they start to become shaky or lightheaded or irritable and end up oftentimes craving sweets or craving some kind of sugar to help bring their blood sugar up to back to a healthy, stable level. But notice what happened in the first place. Their blood sugar went too high. Their blood sugar went really, really high, which is not good. But their insulin level is still working well. Insulin is being made in the pancreas, and the receptors are working really well at this point, so that it's actually able to drive excessively too much glucose into the cells of the body, and then you end up with low blood sugar. Okay? This is not ideal. And if you see this, again, there are things that you can certainly do, but this would be something else that you might see. Now let's look at a third possibility, and this would be in somebody that has insulin resistance. So somebody with insulin resistance may, in fact, also start off with a fasting blood sugar of 90. Now, if they have insulin resistance, chances are it might be a little bit higher, but we'll just go ahead and keep it equal. So they start before their glucose solution at 90. Now, what might happen with them is at 20 minutes, it might go up to, again, 150. And then what you'll tend to see in somebody with insulin resistance is that it will never really come down, sometimes even after 2 hours. Sometimes it will stay excessively high, but that's classic insulin resistance. And going back to the physiology of this that we talked about, when blood sugar goes up, if insulin doesn't work correctly, insulin, if it's not being released or if the receptors aren't working well, they are not getting adequate amounts of blood sugar into the cells of their body, and what you see is that it never returns back to a normal healthy state. Now this is problematic because one is you likely have elevated insulin levels, but two, you also have elevated glucose levels, which, as we talked about, is damaging to the body. So now that we talked about the ways that you can evaluate your own insulin and blood sugar, now let's talk a little bit about what you can do. So now that we've talked all about insulin, blood sugar, how the whole system works, hopefully you've been able to evaluate yourself. Maybe you even have some blood chemistries that you can look at. But at the very least, if you have symptoms, then here's some things you might want to do. I strongly recommend, however, that you get adequate lab testing from a qualified practitioner first before you do any of these recommendations. You really need lab testing first. So let's say, first of all, somebody has hypoglycemic tendencies. Hypoglycemic tendencies, again, would be if your blood sugar goes too low, if you find yourself shaky or irritable in between meals, if you find that when you eat, you actually are energized because of that. Here are some things that you can do. First and foremost, you must eat frequently. Preferably small protein-based meals. In somebody with hypoglycemic tendencies, they have an inability to raise their own body's blood sugar. And if that's the case, you need to exogenously, or from the outside, almost as if you have an IV drip of glucose going in slowly to your body, try to maintain that healthy, stable blood sugar via your meals. So small, protein-based, frequent meals are an absolute must for somebody with hypoglycemic tendencies. You need to keep your blood sugar levels stable for a number of reasons, but primarily for brain function. Okay, that's in conventional medicine, they know that the first organ to be damaged in hypoglycemic tendencies is the brain. So the first thing that you must do, and it's not about a fancy supplement, you really truly have to plan out your days, have some form of good, healthy, low glycemic, protein-based snacks available so that you're eating every 2 to 3 hours. You must maintain your blood sugar level outside of yourself because your body doesn't seem to be able to do it from the inside. Now, the other thing to do, however, is to look at other systems. For example, like cortisol. Things like cortisol, glucagon, growth hormone, all those hormones are normally secreted by your body in order to raise your blood sugar if it gets too low. So you might want to look at some other systems in your body that aren't functioning properly, that aren't enabling you to maintain a normal, healthy blood sugar itself. Now, if somebody has hypoglycemic tendencies, you are either somebody that has true hypoglycemic tendencies because you're not able to get your blood sugar up to a stable level, or you're at that very early tendency of insulin resistance, the first phase that we talked about of that progression. If you're the first one and it's cortisol based, obviously you need to look a little bit further to find out if that's your issue. But if it is because it's early insulin resistance, then eating frequently is important, but all the next steps that we're going to apply for insulin-resistant individuals would apply to you as well. So let's say then you had insulin-resistant tendencies. And these are people that would get fatigued after a meal, that crave sweets and continue to crave sweets even after they eat sweets, and might have high glucose, or maybe the triglyceride-cholesterol ratio is a little bit close together. Now, I won't go into detail about this here. It's in the supporting details or the supplemental materials. I'll also talk a little bit about this in the gastrointestinal fat loss connection video. But the first thing that you really want to do is an elimination diet. And again, without going into the details of this, the reason why is because somebody that has insulin resistance usually has a number of other systems that aren't working well. And one of those systems is likely to be the immune system. What you want to do is calm down the immune system and inflammation as much as you possibly can. The number one source of inflammation for us nowadays would be diet. And if your diet is giving you foods that are toxic to you, that you might have sensitivities to, You want to try to remove those as much as you can. And another reason why is because foods that you're sensitive to can actually be a stress. And if it is a stress, then your body releases cortisol, which will release blood sugar, raise blood sugar, which then raises insulin and contributes to this whole issue in the first place. So what you really want to do is to eliminate any foods that might be causing inflammation. Now, this isn't going to necessarily correct blood sugar issues, but it's the first step. You have to get rid of inflammation before you even attempt to try to regulate things like blood sugar. The second thing, and this kind of goes without saying, is to do exercise. Now again, there are some resources found in the supplemental materials on great exercise programs. Just to put it frankly, you need to really work hard. And I'm not talking about a nice walk around the block, though there's benefits to that. I'm talking about hard interval type training for a short period of time, a few times a week. That will help to improve those exercise-induced GLUT4 vesicles to help bring glucose into the cells to actually be utilized. So this goes without saying that you need to have low inflammation and you need to exercise, and that's imperative in order to help manage blood sugar. After the elimination diet and you've started a good exercise program, what you now want to do, and again, we've heard this many, many times, but is to really focus on the foods that you eat. What you want to do is have high quality foods and low quantity. What I mean by that is spend money on good food, but don't eat so much of it. So you want to spend your money on good, lean meat, healthy vegetables, low processed carbohydrates. In fact, getting rid of processed foods in general is probably a pretty good idea. And again, there's so many diets out there that tell you how to do this. But if you find that you have insulin resistance, either it's late stage insulin resistance or perhaps it's very early insulin resistance, what you want to do is to try to impact your insulin levels by the foods that you eat, lowering inflammation, improving glucose's clearance from your bloodstream, and then trying to moderate the foods that you're eating to be anti-inflammatory and of a low glycemic nature so that you don't negatively impact your glucose levels. And then lastly are supplements. Now, there are a plethora of supplements that will serve to improve insulin resistance. But here's the key point that I want to make about this. The goal of all this is not to lower your blood sugar. The goal of this is to improve insulin's function. There are a number of medications that are used for diabetics that basically tell the pancreas to make more insulin. Now, there's a problem with that. It was high insulin that caused the problem in the first place. Yes, glucose is toxic, but it was high insulin that caused insulin issues in the first place, insulin receptor issues, for example, so that glucose couldn't get in the cell. So the response, have the body make more insulin. Well, if that was the problem in the first place, it's just going to make the problem worse. There are also natural supplements. There are herbs that do the exact same thing. Those are things that you honestly want to avoid. What you want to do is to improve insulin's efficiency, or the ability for insulin to work. You want to improve the receptor sites. You want to improve the pancreas's ability to make insulin if it's not making enough. So your goal is not just to lower blood sugar, because honestly, anybody can lower blood sugar. And in the conventional studies, it's been shown that lowering blood sugar is not necessarily the right thing to do with diabetics, and they still have all the same problems. Maybe because it wasn't the sugar that was causing an issue, but the insulin that was causing an issue. So what you want to do, your goal with supplements, and again, these are listed, the appropriate supplements are listed in the supplementary materials that came with this video and this course. But what you want to do is try to improve insulin's ability. Not just to increase insulin, but its ability to work on the receptor sites. So, to summarize, insulin and blood sugar issues can absolutely stop fat loss for a number of different ways. And there's a reason why this is the first video of all the videos that are being produced. Blood sugar issues are easily one of the most prevalent and also most damaging of the body when it comes to health and disease, as well as your ability to lose weight. You must manage blood sugar. You must manage insulin in order to be healthy, to have healthy mood and neurotransmitters, to have a healthy cardiovascular system, to have healthy hormones and a healthy digestive system, but also your ability to lose weight. Hopefully you found this video informative. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have. Again, my contact details are found in the supplement materials that came along with this particular video. Thank you for watching this. I'd love to hear your feedback and comments on it, and have an absolutely wonderful day.